Son in 2014. My graduate advisor was Dr. James Sneed, which is how I'm here to be with you today. We are co-directors on CSUN's Forgotten Casualties Project, which is based here in the Department of Anthropology. And my thesis research was largely funded by CSUN, where I was able to go to the LA DWP archives that held these claims files associated with the victims of the St. Francis Dam disaster of 1928. And through that research, I essentially used cemetery data to do analysis of how the victims have been remembered and memorialized, as well as why the disaster has largely been forgotten on a state and national level, much less most people, other than being here at CSUN and maybe having heard of St. Francis at some point, most people don't know about it unless they are from Santa Clarita area. So talking to you today about the cemeteries of the San Fernando Valley is new for me. I have never done this sort of presentation before, but Dr. Sneed and I have spent a lot of time researching the different cemeteries throughout Los Angeles, and I'll show you a map of those cemeteries in a few minutes. So this was actually exciting for me because I had a chance to specifically go out and visit some of these cemeteries where I wasn't taken there during my St. Francis research. So I grew up in Glendale, so I'm familiar with the cemeteries that way, and that is probably the far east boundary of our San Fernando Valley. I'm sure that was something you guys initially talked about. What are you calling the valley? What are the boundaries? So essentially the cemeteries that I included in that was, it is what it is. I went to Wiki and found out what communities they said were in San Fernando Valley, and then I made sure to cover all the cemeteries within those areas. So this is a list here of the cemeteries in the San Fernando Valley. You have two different types of cemeteries. You have ones that are known as cemeteries, and then you have those that are known as memorial parks. And memorial parks are based on the cemetery in Glendale. Forest Lawn in 1906 was the first memorial park, and it's a different type of cemetery where you went from upright headstones to ground level markers so that they could mow faster and that death wasn't so prevalent. And so I'll show you some pictures. For example, my grandparents were married at the church there at Forest Lawn, Glendale. And one wouldn't think about being married in a cemetery. But again, these were meant as places that people would go and explore and enjoy and not so much focus on the darker aspects of death. So you'll see kind of corresponding with that, those that are cemeteries started much earlier, or they fell out of use before they really transferred to the memorial park plan. I'll go through each of these and show you pictures of each of them, but this is essentially when the first burial in each cemetery or memorial park, and then those that are no longer active, I actually included a last burial date too. And the way I know these is other than San Fernando Mission Cemetery, where there's hundreds of thousands of people buried there potentially, I've actually done full readings of each of these cemeteries, where I've organized Find a Grave groups or other volunteers, and we've gone through and done full readings where we photograph every single grave marker and we put them online. So I have the data from all these. It's a fun project if you're into that sort of thing. So this picture here is the San Fernando Mission Cemetery. This is one of the two oldest cemeteries in Los Angeles, and it's a pretty cool picture. So this kind of helps illustrate where the two missions are at, San Fernando and San Gabriel, and there's a cemetery associated with each. And so up until the 1840s or so, if you were buried here in the Los Angeles area, you were buried at one of these two cemeteries generally. The exception to that is that if you were buried on a family ranch or a family farm. And some of those cemeteries are still around today, and I'll show you some pictures. But largely they've all gone abandoned, inactive, or they've been completely eradicated over time for whatever reason. Vandalism, not so much an issue here in Southern California, but most of my cemetery research was done back in Illinois, or as my husband calls it, Illaboring, because I spent so much time talking about cemeteries in Illinois. But there's agricultural intrusion that takes place. So each time I've gone back over the few years where you have cemeteries adjacent to plowed fields, over time the cemetery is completely eradicated and you find like the grave markers stacked in a pile or something. And so below ground, the burials are still there. Above ground, the markers have just been moved. This is a Tatavium territory map. We're talking today about historic cemeteries, but there's certainly prehistoric cemeteries in the area as well. Different groups practice different disposal practices. Out in Vasquez Rocks, you have a lot of cremations having to do with the Tatavium, but there are burials both in like the Chumash and Tongva areas. So we're really not speaking about those cemeteries today. I know you have here at CSUN in the collections, grave goods associated with some of these cemeteries, as well as at UCLA at the Fowler, and so there's projects associated with those if you want to go online and look, but today we're really dealing largely with historic era. So this is our San Fernando Valley map, and I'm sure this is something we've talked about, but this is just kind of when I think of San Fernando Valley, kind of how I group the time periods and think about it. You have, the native folks that were in this area, and then you have a Spanish era, which is exploration and the establishment of the missions. And then you have the early Rancho period where the land started being allocated. And then that transitions to the Mexican era where the continuous separation of the land with these ranchos. And then between 1834 and 1836, there was secularization of the missions. Then, kind of an American era that takes over where we have California statehood and LA being established. The San Fernando area is heavily impacted at that time by like overland travel. The Homestead Act is essentially where we had like the ranchos being split into land grants, and that's associated with the Homestead Act, specifically. So people were able to get these land patents between 40 and 160 acres, and this resulted in family farms, ranches, and if you have early cemeteries, they're probably associated with these early ranches, and they're family-based, other than the missions cemeteries. And again, if you weren't Catholic, you wouldn't necessarily be buried there. So ultimately, when water was brought to Los Angeles, Mulholland built an aqueduct from the Owens Valley to the San Fernando Valley, and there's heavy drama associated with ultimately the land being acquired so that there could be big, massive orchards and ranches, and that was incorporation in about 1915. So, as I mentioned, the oldest cemetery in the San Fernando Valley, historically speaking, is the Mission Cemetery. So you would have the different native communities that were essentially forced to these missions, and then if they passed away during that time before secularization, they generally were buried at the Mission Cemetery. It's almost completely full now, so this is actually the old San Fernando Mission Cemetery. There is a new San Fernando Mission Cemetery that's just next door, essentially, and that was started in the 60s or 70s. So when people are buried, generally now, unless their families had plots at this cemetery purchased in advance, it's all full. So you have different types of interments in cemeteries. These are kind of like mausoleums, the building in the center here, where you could either have a cremation that was placed in one of these crypts, or an interment that was placed in a crypt. And this here was December of last year. I always try to go to cemeteries during high visitation times to actually kind of watch people and see what they do in cemeteries. And it's amazing because this kind of indicates the visitation. And what I study is memorialization and memory, and how cemeteries are used as a way to continue to perpetuate memory. These are both text and artifact, these grave markers. They really encapsulate historical archaeology. Please.
What are some of those times of year that there's most traffic?
Holidays, so especially any military holiday. Sometimes the cemeteries will have volunteer groups that come in and they place flags on each of the graves, and then they come back and take the flags up so that then they can be mowed afterwards. And other than that, generally it's around Christmas time. If it's a religious cemetery, it's going to be around like religious holidays, Easters, things like that. But I found mostly, and it depends. Day of the Dead is big too.
I was going to ask.
Too.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. So either of the mission cemeteries, San Fernando or San Gabriel, you'd have some good heavy use. And then there's some other ones that are outside of San Fernando, but like Hollywood Forever Cemetery.
Yeah.
They're awesome. Yeah, you can go see movies there. They have a really cool Day of the Dead celebration. And so, I mean, that's a fantastic time. And it's a really good example of how a cemetery has been able to stay in use, where so many other cemeteries, over time, there's less people visiting the cemetery, and so these memorials, they have spatial and temporal scales. They are meant to convey a certain period of time, and once that's exceeded, social memory is tested, and these places fall abandoned. I mean, that's kind of like the liminal period that I'm interested. Please.
So what happens then after they become like abandoned? I mean, what do they end up?
Some of them, and I have a lot that I'll show you today because there's several here in the San Fernando Valley. They're usually adopted by their community, and like Hills of Peace, which is the Verdugo Hills Cemetery, you'll see they different times a year they do role playing. So they have people dress up in garb from the era, and they dress like people that are buried in the cemetery. The founding people of Tahunga, essentially, because that's where it's at, and they raise funds. They meet at Bolton Hall there in like Sunland Tahunga area, and they get you on buses and they charge you money, and they do a presentation first, and then they'll take you up to the cemetery. It's completely fenced, and you can't visit it normally because of the abandoned status. It would be heavily vandalized. So that's an example. I live in Mid-Wilshire area, close to like Adams Morgan area, and there's Angeles Rosedale, which is one of the oldest cemeteries in LA, and they have a huge history, genealogy, like following, and they do the same thing. They do like role playing in the cemetery, or you have a like Hollywood Forever that does the movies.
Yeah, I was asking because I remember about, was it maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the big scandal in Inglewood with the cemetery, and then basically like repurposing the abandoned graves and charging plot fees again and reburying people.
Now, I actually, the only St. Francis victim I was unable to track down, although I have Inglewood Cemetery in 1928 saying he was buried there, but he's no longer buried there. And so, yeah, you have to wonder. And I have other examples, including my great-grandparents that are at Grandview Memorial Park, where they were cremated, and they essentially, like, threw their ashes, like, out of the containers into, like, the basement of the building, and the cemetery's been shut down. And I mean, there's multiple cemeteries this has occurred at, because in the end, these are like for profit a lot of times, and that's a very interesting like model that has taken place, and it's largely because of this memorial park plan. But there's no easy answers. This is not just something that's an issue here in Los Angeles, and especially when there's only so much space and real estate's so expensive. And there's a diminishing amount of returns, like perpetual care funds, essentially. When you're buried, you pay a flat amount, and that's supposed to take care of your grave in perpetuity. And it's only as good as the person that runs the cemetery that chooses to invest those funds properly. And if they choose to, like, go on vacation with them, like, it's really hard to, it sounds really, like, to me, it's like flabbergasting to know that people do that, but they absolutely do. This is a common theme as I was kind of researching each of these cemeteries for this presentation, that I had no idea how extensive it was. And for a good number of them that we'll go through today, I'll point out one way or another, or you can Google afterwards and see.
Just a quick question. Some places they're public cemeteries, and you pay for the cemetery as a part of the property tax, cemetery fee. Mm-hmm. Is that not common in this area?
My understanding is it's based on a perpetual care fund. And so, yes, there's like common, like that you pay into like a common maintenance essentially, but it is ultimately up to the cemetery to save a certain amount of that money and plan for the future. But it's all based on, essentially they're always like, like selling ahead kind of. And so at some point you run out of space. And so they have like today's burials paying for past burials, kind of like what's done with archaeological collections, by the way. I find it interesting, like corollary there. But yeah, so essentially you'll run out of like space in the cemetery, and then like because you don't have additional funds coming in if that perpetual care fund wasn't properly invested. There's a lot of cemeteries that end up being taken over by the state as a result, and I'll show you a few of those today. Love all the questions. It's great. So this is Brand Family Cemetery in my hometown of Glendale, and it is essentially behind El Mirabello, which was Brand's house, and he's known as the father of Glendale. He was an early developer, and his house is now the public library, and his property is now Brand Park. And so you can actually go there, and behind the doctor's house, which is a Queen Anne Victorian that they've moved there to the property, you can go up a trail and you can access this cemetery. Beautiful, really well kept, but the city has volunteers that run the doctor's house, and they also take care of the cemetery. Having asked, there aren't descendants that are really still in the area maintaining. That's another way the cemeteries are maintained. In this case, it's done by a historical society. And the pyramid is kind of a unique feature, a little bit of opulence there in the hills. Most people have like these flat grave markers, but the Brands were very well to do, and it's not just it's Brand and his wife. It's a family cemetery, but his parents are also buried there. His sister's buried there, as well as her husband, who was at Dryden. Dryden's one of the streets in Glendale. Kind of made me laugh as I was going through the list of interments here. I was like, oh, all the street names. Brand also was extremely interested in airplanes, and that resulted in him bringing Grand Central Air Terminal to Glendale. And I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, a little side note, but it's a really interesting property. It's now owned by Disney, and you can take tours. But this was significant. This is where, like, Charles Lindbergh plotted his first nation, like, cross-nations, regularly scheduled flights. And it's where Amelia Earhart bought her first airplane. So, I mean, it's really, really interesting, and it's just something that, Brand brought to Glendale. And this is the memory today, and this is really amazing that it's in this beautiful a shape. So, not all the cemeteries are really in that condition, unfortunately. This is one I was speaking of just a moment ago. It's Verdugo, now known as Hills of Peace. And it's up in Tujunga, and as you can tell from the photos, it looks rather sparse today. It is no longer an actively used cemetery. The last burial was in 1979. It's behind a chain link fence, and as you can see, a lot of the grave markers are really sunk far down, and they're actually completely covered until we're like exposing them here, and they're sliding down a hillside. And so what happened here is in 1978, there was torrential rains in February, and the graves washed out of the cemetery down the foothills into people's houses. And Noguchi, Coroner Noguchi, he wrote a book about this, but he actually had to come back through, find all the different, like, reinsure the individuals, but you had to identify who was who. And that was quite a grim process because a lot of these interments had been so long ago. But today you can see on the landscape what's occurred as a result. I mean, they've tried the best they can, but it's kind of built on a hillside, and so the graves are really slid sideways. And anyway, so this is one of the cemeteries. I took this picture on the bottom on one of their open house days, and they dressed like the early residents of Tujunga and told stories of, what people would be doing on an average evening and what their lives were like. And it's cool. It's a way to, like, share some oral histories that they had collected in the past, and then we're kind of like reacting these out. Reenactments, yeah. So this is Grandview Memorial Park, and this used to be known as Glendale Cemetery, but it was renamed with the Memorial Park Plan, and then they followed. So this cemetery is unique, where you can see in the backgrounds there's upright markers, and then there's also like flat markers. So it was established in 1884, and then when it was in like the 1920s, after the Memorial Park Plan came in, it was renamed Grandview. And at that time, they added like a very large arch entrance and made it more of like a park versus planting trees and things like that. And there's these extremely large mausoleums that are here that are actually really well known, where you have, you know, tens of thousands of people, cremations placed in these like niches for the cremations and crypts for interments. In 2006, the state suspended Grandview's license as a cemetery when they found cremations of about 4,000 people stuffed into storage rooms and trash containers, literally trash cans. And so as of 2006, it was closed. Some of those include my great-grandparents here. This is George Young and his wife, Amelia. And so we don't know where they're at today, you know. But that's just part of the reality of cemeteries and burial today, and something you should think about as you age and what you ultimately want done, you know, what you want your memory to be. So this is my brother and his wife, and we're doing a cemetery cleanup day because these are other relatives that are buried here in the cemetery. So we essentially have to just bring trowels and things like that and dig up the graves because there's several inches of grass, crabgrass. It's not so easy to. This is a before and after. So essentially what you do is you have like plot maps, and so you kind of count. You can see the dips where the graves are actually from, like, it's just the remains of the burials. It doesn't lay out flat after they refill the graves generally. So you do the best you can to count over, and then you kind of like pull a little bit of grass off and go, oh, I'm in the right area, and then you clean them off completely. And so between about 2007 and 2013, my mom would go, and I would go every Sunday to Grandview, and we did Find a Grave requests. So Find a Grave is a website where you can place a request for somebody to take a photo of a grave marker. So if you do genealogy and you want to see, you know, an ancestor's grave, but you're not physically able to travel to that location, you can request, and there's volunteers like me that go out and take these photos. So that's largely what this process was for, and it was just to help be like a community activity, essentially, too, and I found it interesting. As an anthropologist, always kind of studying the people that do this sort of activity, too. So as of 2014, the cemetery was reopened. They came up with a new plan, and they were funded so they could get things back in place. Water and drought issues here in California result with the grass. It's not really, depending on the time of year I took these photos, you can see a huge variation. But they don't really water at cemeteries right now. They're on restrictions, and they'll actually be fined by the city if they choose to do that. So most of the time the cemeteries are kind of brown. But this now has active burials taking place, and they have hired crews to come through and clear all the grass off so that all the graves are exposed, because it was really like a patchwork based on who had Find a Grave requests, which was interesting to see over time as more of them popped up. This is just another example of one that I found where, like, okay, this is probably the right area. You know, there's like a tree on the map, and so the different stages to ultimately like exposing the grave marker, and then we take the picture and put it online. Okay, this is a great cemetery. This is Morningside, and Morningside is up on Bledsoe, so it's at Foothill Boulevard in Bledsoe and Silmar. And it was established in 1874, and the last burial appears to be about 1939. It was known as the San Fernando Cemetery, and it's the oldest non-denominational cemetery in the San Fernando Valley. So if you weren't buried at the mission, you were generally buried here. And because this cemetery was owned by an individual, Will Noble, who was an undertaker, as a result, he didn't have particularly good records that separated all the individuals he processed in his business versus the ones that were buried here. So for many years, there was a thought that there was about 700 or 800 individuals buried at this cemetery. But the issue is, over the years, people have absconded with all the grave markers. During like the 50s, they used them as ballast in racing cars, Foothill Boulevard. People use them to line their walks in the back of their homes, unfortunately, or they just think they're pretty to use in their yards. So most of them have been missing. Yeah, it's kind of a strange thing. But, you know, it's actually, having looked at multiple cemeteries throughout LA, it's fairly common that if the cemetery is not fenced and it's inactive, markers are going to walk away. There was this ground penetrating radar study that was done by Brian Damiata, who is a geophysicist at UCLA, and he mapped the entire graveyard in 2010, and he was funded by the Historical Society there in San Fernando. They raised funds to do this. There was only 210 grave markers, or graves found, anomalies found that they believe are burials. And so they were like, what do we have going on here? 700 in the register, 200 graves. And so they didn't really know what to do, and they were kind of perplexed. And then I entered the picture because this GPR study came up with an anomaly that they thought was a mass grave. And so they figured if it's a mass grave, it's St. Francis victims, because that's the big disaster that's taken place here. So I didn't have that showing up in the records I was using, and so I had to truth it in some way. So my mom and I contacted the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, and they have all the death certificates digitized. Well, they had them on microfiche, essentially. And so I asked them, I said, I'm doing this volunteer project. Could you send these to me for free? And they said no. They sent me a letter back, and they said, no, sorry, we can't do that. And so I was kind of bummed out. And about 10 days later, I got an email, and they had digitized them all and put them online for me. So, I mean, that was phenomenal. And so over the last 4 or 5 years, my mom and I have essentially gone through thousands and thousands and thousands of death certificates, watching TV, drinking a glass of wine, whatever, like looking for Morningside, Sarah, seriously, it's what I do, looking for Morningside Cemetery to pop up, and we've found 200 death certificates, and we've covered the expanse that the cemetery was open, essentially. We didn't have to look at every death certificate, just the years the cemetery was active. So here we have an example of texts, death certificates, these records, verifying pretty much what the GPR studies were. And they're interesting findings. Essentially, this was a pauper's burial field for the Hispanic Americans in the area. Noble, he also was very active and owned plots at Oakwood Cemetery, so when he processed individuals in his undertaking business, he generally buried them at Oakwood, which is another cemetery we'll look at. But he allowed the local residents that couldn't afford to bury their stillborn children and things like that, he allowed them to bury them here. That's what most of these death certificates are. They're, stillborn births or, kids that died just in the first few years of life. And most, I don't have the statistics with me right here, but most of them are young burials. So this is at Forest Lawn, Glendale, and this is the Builder's Creed. And it's there next to the mausoleums, and it's quite powerful. It essentially talks about the vision that Hubert Eaton had. He's the one that came up with this concept of a memorial park plan. And he is known as revolutionizing cemeteries in the whole United States with this memorial park plan. So he kind of transformed this vision of cemeteries as, places where the dead were to places that you could go and celebrate life. And he was trying to, kind of rethink what people thought about death ultimately. And just reading a little bit from it, I believe in a happy, eternal life. I believe those of us who are left behind should be glad in the certain belief that those gone before who believed in him have entered into that happier life. I believe most of all that Christ smiles down on you and me. Therefore, I know cemeteries of today are wrong because they depict an end, not a beginning. They have consequently become unsightly stone yards full of inartistic symbols and depressing customs. places that do nothing for humanity save a practical act, and that not well. So he essentially has this creed that he wrote where he was just going to change the way that, cemeteries looked. And he certainly did that. So these are a few. This is, my great-grandmother was a painter here. She had a studio on Sunset Boulevard, so she painted this picture for my grandparents of Little Church of the Flowers where they were married in the Forest Lawn Cemetery, and this hangs in my parents' house, which is kind of cool. This here was when I was out looking for St. Francis victims. These are Margie and Maisie Curtis, who were at Power Plant 2 and killed when the floodwaters went through the DWP community. And then here is essentially locating graves that are unmarked. And so sometimes you had individuals that there's a reason why this grave was left unmarked, and I'll tell you, but sometimes, from what I found, there's a large number of victims that were not memorialized, and that's what I found fascinating. Here, these people had been killed in such a tragic manner, and the LADWP did claims payouts to not only pay for the burials, but then, other funds where they could have placed a marker, and a lot of times they weren't placed. You had a question?
I just, real quick, you had 2 forest lawns listed. You had one that had an F in parentheses and another one that had an HH.
Yes, so there's Forest Lawn Glendale and there's Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills.
Oh, that's Hollywood Hills.
Those are just the 2 that are in San Fernando Valley.
Gotcha.
Forest Lawn is, I think there's like 6 throughout the greater LA and Orange County area. That's a good question. I'll get to that one. So let's see if I can. I have a friend that's gone through and just kind of likes this, we're called cataphiles, like just going to cemeteries and looking around. She did this really cool essay on Forest Lawn where here you have the gates, it is known as the Disneyland of death to a lot of people. The gates are supposed to look like replicas of ones from Buckingham Palace. And it's kind of like a storybook fairy tale setting. You don't know if you're necessarily in a cemetery. Beautiful churches, amazing stained glass. They're actually, the Forest Lawn is really well known for its stained glass, and they have a museum there at the cemetery, which is fascinating. So, you just wouldn't even imagine that this is necessarily a cemetery, but it's everything to distract you from your own mortality. Okay, yeah. So, Forest Lawn, Glendale, if you're going to visit one cemetery, even though it's not right here near Seaside necessarily, I'd highly recommend you go to Forest Lawn, Glendale. You can go visit Michael Jackson's grave, all sorts of stars are buried there. William Mulholland's buried there. I went and told, and it's kind of hard to actually access these areas because they're all stars that are buried in the mausoleum, so you just have to say you're there to, visit Uncle Mulholland or something. And that's actually what I did. So I felt very silly, but it worked. Yeah. So this is the other Forest Lawn that was listed. This is Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills. It's also established in 1906. Follows that same Memorial Park plan. I love this picture because you kind of get a full view of where it's at, as well as its proximity to the Hollywood sign. So this is really at the far end of the San Fernando Valley, the south end. I would imagine this is a natural barrier that moves into a different area. This is no longer San Fernando. So this was actually a filming location. It was used by Cecil B. DeMille and a bunch of other people I could list that are way past your knowledge for your age, essentially. But Eaton did something really sneaky to be able to make this burial area cemetery. he made it known to the local community. He wanted to make this like the Forest Lawn in Glendale, and they were not happy, especially like the Hollywood folks. And so he went to the morgue and claimed John Doe's and buried them in the middle of the night.
Whoa.
And then the next morning said, by law, it's now a cemetery. And that actually flew. And that's the history of Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, which is pretty amazing, yeah. So this one is another one that's really great to visit as well. They have like the church there is supposed to be like the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, back east, these historical contexts that are kind of cool. I love this because it has these rolling hills that go down to the boulevard, and I'd have to pass that every morning when I worked at the Autry, and my great-grandma are buried there, so I was always able every morning to, as the sun's rising, to lake wave to them, so I thought it was kind of cool. This is Valhalla Cemetery, also known as Blessed Hope. This one's closer by, and again, it's a memorial park plan. So you have flat grave markers, wide expansive grass areas, big fountains, but they also have this portal of the folded wings shrine to aviation. This used to be the entrance of the cemetery, and over time it's changed, where now you have to drive to the very back of the cemetery to see it, but there's a lot of aviation pioneers buried here in the cemetery, and this is a memorial to that. So it's quite a large cemetery. It'd be a good one to go visit. So this is Oakwood Memorial Park, and it's in Chatsworth. And a lot of movie stars are also buried there, including Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. I came across those when I was doing the reading, and that was kind of cool. So it is surrounded by these really rocky hills. It's near the Simi Valley. It's kind of going to be like a western edge of San Fernando. And so it was a backdrop for a lot of films, which is cool. It's only been used since 1924, and it's always been known as a memorial park. Similar to some cemeteries here in LA, this originally was a Native American burial ground. And eventually there was a fire that came through and destroyed all the old wooden markers and crosses that marked those graves. There's also a stagecoach trail that goes right by it, and they have moved historic structures from throughout Chatsworth into the cemetery to kind of protect them and then provide that memorial park landscape, which is neat. There are several St. Francis victims buried there, which is what brought me to this cemetery initially, and as I was walking around, I found not only a grave marker for an individual, and it's really hard to see this, but actually then a memorial plaque for the family as well, which is really cool. And I was just on a rock, essentially, like next to a tree as I was driving down the road, and I saw St. Francis pop out because I have that on the brain. So it's kind of neat to see these sorts of memorials as well as the grave markers. All totally different topic for another day, but different, like iconography is used on grave markers, and so there's a lot of studies that in the past have been done where like death heads and cherubs up in like the New England areas have been like the classic analysis of iconography. And those are amazing too. If you ever go to like New York or anywhere in the East, go visit a cemetery, seriously. Very cool. This is Glen Haven Memorial Park, and it's up in Sylmar. It's a newer cemetery, and it's really tucked away. You wouldn't even know it's there. It's kind of in the middle of a residential community. I wasn't able to find a whole lot about it online, but from our reading, I was able to determine that it started in about 1940. That's the earliest burial that I could find. And it's interesting where it's not fenced in any way. Most cemeteries today are fenced, and they have hours they're open and closed, and this is really an open plan where, I was there in the evening and people were walking their kids through the park, the cemetery essentially, and just interacting with it like it is a park when it's not, definitely a burial ground. It has an interesting shape and layout there. That's from the brochure of how it's planned. But I just kind of was nosing around behind the mausoleum area and came across this, which is an old, essentially this is where they did cremations at one point, and it's like just the mechanism for it that's sitting out behind the cemetery, and it was really creepy. But I hadn't really seen it before, that sort of It's essentially where you place a body and then you do a cremation. Yeah. And this is Eden Memorial Park. This is a cemetery that has had some issues with being accused of throwing away bones. So this is a Jewish cemetery, and it's located in Mission Hills, kind of close to the mission. There's a lot of Jewish individuals from the entertainment industry buried there, including Lenny Bruce and Groucho Marx. The cemetery has been sued multiple times. They're essentially accused of breaking vaults open and taking the burials out and throwing the bones away in the trash. So current and former groundskeepers of the cemetery have admitted that they did this. And so the state stepped in for a little while. There's been some major settlements that have resulted in it. But it's a beautifully maintained cemetery. And you can see a fresh burial that's down there. That was interesting. And so this is another Jewish cemetery. It's just down the road from Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, right next to Griffith Park. And it is also like a lot of Jewish individuals from the entertainment industry are buried here. These are slightly different cemeteries, the Jewish cemeteries, where I found that they're generally associated with like temples. And so they have a congregation. Please.
Yeah, so I guess the last cemetery that you were talking about, you said that some of the groundskeepers were throwing the bones away and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Was it because they needed more space?
Exactly. They essentially are running out of space. So even though it does, the first thing that's strange is that there looks like there's a lot of space open here, but some of these plots could be sold already. Families generally have like buying a plot where you'll have mom and dad, and they'll also usually there's the husband and wife, but sometimes they'll buy 6 burials in one like plot, and so it's a family. And it's a little bit different here. In older cemeteries, generally what you did is you had one family marker that had the family name, and then each person had individual small plaques that were their markers. And when we went to this memorial park plan, we went to individual markers for each person. So when you had that family plot, it was easier with upright markers. It was easier to visualize how it looked, and they very much are like squares. And generally, if you look in the grass, you can actually see it like quarter sectioned off and like each plot listed. So either they're sold and not used yet, or the next thing that I realized with the St. Francis victims is a lot of graves are just not marked. It's very expensive to bury someone. And then I'm sure there's also a lot emotionally associated with it, where depending on how the person passed away, either you might have a very grand marker, or there may not be marker at all. The St. Francis victim at Forest Lawn, Glendale, whose grave is unmarked, she was essentially having an affair with the dam keeper and living up there, and had left her husband, who was an LA County sheriff, and he was mad that she went and did this, and so he didn't mark her grave. And it's not too hard to understand why, I guess, didn't have to leap too far there. But it was hard because that's such a tragic death that the grave's unmarked. Please.
How did they find out that they were throwing out the bones? Did the former family member this is not where
you do, exactly. Aunt so-and-so comes from back east to visit the grave one day and goes to the office, and they tell her where it's located, and she's been here 20 years ago and saw the grave, and goes out there, and it's somebody else buried there now. What's going on? Yeah, and that kept occurring. The other thing is they were doing this while people were actively visiting the cemetery, and so it just is a little shady. Yeah, absolutely. When you see open crypt areas.
Which one was it you had mentioned had the stagecoach trail going through it that was the old?
Sure, that's Oakwood Cemetery in Chatsworth. Yeah. So as we're going through each of these, ultimately I want to spend some time getting feedback from you guys about what you're individually researching about the San Fernando Valley, and I can help provide direction about the best place to really find good, biographical information about individuals graves in cemeteries, you know, and then you get, because you go visit the one, you see all the other family members buried there too, and it helps provide some context. Like this cemetery in the Verdugo Hills Cemetery, it really clearly lays out who the founding folks were in the Tujunga area. It just depends, and maybe that's not what your focus is. You know, you're dealing more with like the mission collections or the old adobes. And then there's other things like, ultimately, we'll get to it, but all your like Lancashires and all those folks, they're not buried here in the San Fernando Valley because they weren't Catholic, and when they, you know, as a result, they were taken to LA. So most of the Lancashires and all those people are over at Evergreen Cemetery in East LA, which is an amazing cemetery too. So you can actually like go online and Google and kind of like hear or see some of the you know, accounts of what was going on at this cemetery. There's some interesting interviews. I think that there's been 2 rounds of litigation and some settlements. Yeah, and again, Mount Sinai, which is another one of the Jewish cemeteries that's near Forest Lawn. So those are the cemeteries of the San Fernando Valley. And as I just was pointing out, I found it interesting. I gave Sneed some readings that hopefully you found interesting in some way. There was the one that was Edwin Carpenter's Early Cemeteries of Los Angeles. And I had assigned that for a reading in another class that I covered for Sneed a year or 2 ago. And he's like, oh, make sure you like cover that or give me that article again. And I told him, I was like, but there's no San Fernando Valley cemeteries, you know, in it. And so it made me think, like, well, that means something too, ultimately. And so because it wasn't until 1915 with bringing water to Los Angeles that this area really finally had a boom and exponential growth. As a result, most of the cemeteries, when you go back and look at when they were established, was around that time period. And so burials earlier than that, unless they were at the Mission Cemetery or at Pioneer, which, you know, I think there actually were a lot more interments at one point, and I think the story actually is that they disinterred those individuals and moved them to other cemeteries. Because we've come across that where, like, the death certificate says they're buried at Pioneer, but then when we look today, they're buried at, like, Forest Lawn, Glendale.
Why
so,
would that take place?
Because people were actively going to visit those graves and realizing the cemetery was falling into disrepair. And so they, you know, must have had the funds to be able to do that, and they moved them. And that's actually fairly common to take place. We're not talking about all the cemeteries of LA today, but you have many early cemeteries that, so this is a map I've made that's all the cemeteries of in Los Angeles. And this is just like, you can go into Google Maps and make your own maps. It's pretty simple. You can do them different ways too, but I just did it this way. So where this little polygon is here is your San Fernando area, and then I just color-coded them. So some of these are inactive cemeteries. They're old family farm cemeteries that are no longer in use. These ones here, again, are San Fernando, and then slightly different color is the rest of LA, and these are active. And then these blue ones here are a whole different thing that I never even realized before, but all the like Catholic churches have something called columbariums, and essentially you bring your cremated relative and you place them at the church, and it's just a temporary place versus having their cremations at home. And then at some point, if you maybe move to a new congregation, you bring them home.
I have a question regarding the Native American map you had at the beginning, the Tatavium.
Sure.
And it had a designated, on the map you had a designated border for the territory. And I'm just wondering if that was a fluctuating border, because I noticed you have like Chile is in there, and Peru, and those different locations there in the corner. And I know that there's kind of conflicting back and forth whether that was Chumash or Tatavium, or, you know, did it go back and forth? And is it known now that that was, like, Peru is considered Tatavium?
I think generally Peru is considered Tatavium, but these are fluid boundaries, these individuals.
Yeah,
they're not just Chumash or Tatavium, sometimes too. I did get this from like the Fernandino Tatavium website, so it probably is centric to their perspective of the village names and where they were located. But these, again, are fluid. So this is your Ventura, LA County boundary, which is the yellow there.
Yeah.
So all the way over here, you'd have the Chumash that were like Venturano. And then you'd have the Tatavium that were from like Santa Clarita area coming down that way, and then the Tonga, Fernandino that were kind of Hollywood Hills area.
Well, I know, like linguistically, I know that they like consider like Piru being like a Chumash word meaning tule.
Exactly.
And there are other like different words that they use that they're kind of like on the cusp.
Mm-hmm.
Is Tatavium considered linguistically similar to Chumash, or it's totally separate like Tonga?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer for that. Because I've largely studied historical archaeology, more like the not proto-historic. I'm not as familiar with that, but I know there's a lot of language maps out, and I'm sure you're familiar. But John Harrington did a lot of ethnographic work and linguistic work specifically, and so I would kind of go that direction to answer that question.
I work with like Oprah, Queen Docent, and what have you, and I know like they consider some of those words like Chumash and have the definitions of them there. So I'm just like wondering if that was overlapping or
Sure.
just when I saw it, I was like, wait a minute.
No, I would have to imagine they largely influence each other, in this regard. And then where the map doesn't really show it well, but visually thinking about traveling up like the Santa Clara River Valley to someplace like Piru, and I could envision that kind of be heavily like the two groups, we're together. But Bowers Cave, which is east of Piru, is considered Chumash.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's that whole thing that they had with San Nicolas Island, and
that was another example, and I was like, no, I'm not going to bring that up. Please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
yeah.
Please do.
No, because I mean that they ended up giving that to Pachanga because they and it all had to go back. It all went back to the lone woman of San Nicolas, and the 4 words that they were able to quote unquote decipher from her linguistically, and they weren't Chumash words, and the closest related words that they could find to that were Tongva. And because of the association and the fact that Tongva is not a federally recognized tribe, and Pachanga linguistically was the closest relative language to that, that's how they ended up passing the torch over to them. So, I don't know.
It is quite interesting, 4 words ultimately.
Yeah.
So, and now everything's at a screeching halt as far as finishing the excavations there for Cal State LA.
So where did they consider Tongva then?
So I grew up in Glendale. I was taught Chumash a while ago. I think they're doing better now, but that would be Tongva as far as I know.
They all overlap kind of, but
they really do. But I think there's somewhere in the Beverly Hills area, there's some springs, my understanding, that you can visit, and those are considered Tongva. And then Gabrielino Tongva, I would imagine, as you're going further east along the foothills, kind of transitions.
Yeah, because then they go, you say, Tahunga and Cahuenga, and then they say, well, no, that's Tongva. And it's like, I don't know.
Well, and all the, villages along the coast, Topanga, that's a Chumash word.
Oh yeah, Malibu and
Woo-woo,
and Guanini and all that stuff. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So, I'm sorry I don't have the answer,
No,
but
it's okay.
I'm not
it just
caught my attention there,
Yeah.
so I just wanted to ask.
it's on, this map is online. It's great.
Okay, thank you very much.
Please.
My first immigrating ancestor from Poland died in a bar fight. He was hit over the head in a bar fight, and he was then committed to Steilacoom Cemetery, or Steilacoom Institution, which was a mental institution up in Washington, where he later died of pneumonia and was then buried with just a marker that had a number for it. And so later we were able to find out where he was through an amazing series of circumstances, really incredible. Obviously his wife wasn't able to exert any power because she was financially unable and legally, unable to reclaim his name at that time. Do we have anything like that in Los Angeles or in this area where we have institutionalized cemeteries that were attached to areas where kind of like control had been relinquished from the family and people?
Yes, there is. There is, I want to say it's down in the Wilmington area. My understanding there was some, not like a VA hospital, but something along those lines. And it was a mental hospital, and they had an associated burial ground at a nearby cemetery, and they're just numbered burials. Unfortunately, that cemetery has its own set of circumstances where in the 1940s, 30s, it had fallen into disrepair, and so the city removed all the markers, and they put them in the backyard of a historical society. And they sat there till just a few years ago, when a gentleman from Acton, out in Canyon Country, purchased them and put them on his property because they were going to put the high-speed rail through that area. And he didn't want the high-speed rail going near his property. So he manufactured this cemetery from these grave markers that belong down in like Wilmington area. I mean, it's just it's a really interesting story. So as you're driving along the 14, you can see these markers. And it's actually really interesting because they're all oriented in different directions. And that's not actually how burials are. Burials are oriented so your head and foot, it's the sunrise and sunset generally. So it just is a very strange thing. But that's an example. Another one that I'm familiar with is at Angeles Rosedale. There's a whole section, and they're all like stillborn births. And they were kept at a hospital, I believe, probably as part of a study for a while. And then they were eventually interred. And there's just these little tiny plaques and a whole section of them. It's called Babyland.
Oh,
yeah, I know. And it's really amazing. But those, a lot of times, they're not like complete names. I think there's numbers associated with them. And then at Evergreen, right next to Evergreen, is where you have the county crematorium. It's a very interesting ceremony. Once a year, they bury all the individuals that weren't claimed for the year. So say your family just can't afford to do anything with your remains, or nobody claims you. This county will cremate, they hold on to these cremations, and then once a year they do a mass burial of these cremations, and it's a public event where you can go. Very interesting thing that we do. But, it's, to me, that there's something very comforting in that. That even when you're not claimed in any other way, you still have your community that will watch out for you. So it's a very special thing. So,
did somebody else have a hand up? Do you know much about the pet cemetery in Calabasas?
Yeah, I have visited it. I actually had it on my map, and I put it in a different layer because I was like, this is a little weird. But yeah, but it's from like 1927 or something too. It's amazing, yeah. And going through Find a Grave, making sure that I had all the different cemeteries recorded accurately, I found it interesting that there were these horse burials at ranches all over San Fernando and other areas where people, when they lost their horses, would create these online memorials for them. A lot of them are old, like movie horses, and they're like at the different ranches, and other ones, they're not so long ago. But yeah, there's 2 pet cemeteries. There's another one down in like Inglewood area too.
Wow.
That isn't as old, but just as large. And so, where here you have these graves that aren't, the fall out of being maintained, or they don't have grave markers placed, and then you have this whole other like sect that like bury their pets and have grave markers and go visit them.
We were given our quadrangle maps. We were just given some to explore.
Excellent.
And they're from 1952, and the pet cemetery was online. It was
awesome.
Online. I thought, what in the hell is this? It was fascinating, but no other ones were delineated, so it was interesting.
Yeah. No, I was trying to figure out when Oakwood was started for sure, and I basically just worked through like historic maps online where there's a cool sliding scale, and you just like creep it forward, and then it changes the maps and what's available and what kind of popped out. But
so cool.
Yeah, it's neat, and it's neat to see where these cemeteries are, in context to the communities that are around them. And then a lot of times, not so much here because everything's so densely populated, but at other locations, you can see whole communities rise and fall and city centers move based on stagecoach routes, overland trains, that sort of thing. And so I came across that a lot when I was was in Illinois doing research where you had the city like Zanesville where Lincoln stayed, but today it's just a field. And I was able to go and actually find coins in the field. It was fallow, and the landowner allowed me to do that, and it was kind of cool. And then right in the middle of the cemetery right in the middle of the field essentially is the cemetery. And you can tell when they are planting because it's just a few trees in the center of this huge 40-acre parcel of agriculture, and you know that they'd be using every inch of that. And so I tracked down a lot of abandoned cemeteries just by that, driving around and finding trees in the center of fields, getting permission to go walk, and they're like, "Oh yeah, how did you know it's a cemetery?" To me, it's like there's somebody pointing to it because the trees are right there. But anyway, so yeah. So that's pretty much what I had as far as the cemeteries themselves. I wanted to show you this cemetery. I went to Tokyo last November, and this is at Ioma Cemetery. And so just to kind of get a sense of what a different cemetery would look like, these are family plots, but they're actively maintained. So at the cemetery they have these containers where you get water, and they have brushes, and then you go and you clean up the grave as a family, as an activity. They have a mailbox slot, so as people come by, they place their business cards. It's very important to pay respect there, and so family wants to know who's been by to visit that ancestor or the people. So, literally you leave business cards or a note. Sometimes there's things like that in there. This was fantastic because it was fall and everything. But these wooden slats that are back there, they're kind of cool. Those essentially are so there's a marker that has the family name, and then each of those wooden posts are different individuals that are interred there. And over time, they potentially can recycle these graves as a result. I haven't really seen, most of what I saw was very old graves were still being maintained, which is really cool. But just for something a little bit different. So the other thing that Dr. Sneed wanted me to kind of review with you a little bit was some online resources. Because it's historical archaeology, and you are using historical records as well as artifacts to complement that. So, for example, there's newspaper collections that are online, and especially I try to find